Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into, well, what feels like the newest and frankly a pretty chilling chapter of the U.S. China trade conflict. If you thought the friction over the last few years was getting intense, our sources are really confirming that both powers have moved way past just reactive skirmishes. We seem to be in a deliberate, strategic phase now.
That's exactly right. It's a fundamental shift.
We're looking at what some analysts are calling the Thucydides Trap reimagined. And this isn't a fight with, ships or troops in the traditional sense. It's being fought with supply chains, industrial choke points, technological controls. So our mission today is to really unpack this concept of mutually assured disruption. It sounds dramatic, but it seems accurate. Both the established power, the U.S., and the rising power, China, seem to have manufactured this immense leverage over each other. They're wielding essential, non-negotiable links in the global economy, almost like weapons.
That framing, mutually assured disruption, I think is absolutely vital. It really signifies that the era where you could pretend economic policy and national security were separate, well, that's over. In this new phase, economic tools have been entirely formalized as instruments of deterrence, really. It's not just about optimizing trade anymore. It's about strategic paralysis, potentially.
Okay, if that's the gravity of it, let's look at the pattern itself, because it shows this fascinating and, yeah, slightly terrifying strategic symmetry. It really does feel like a perfect yin and yang of leverage.
Yeah.
The U.S. hits the top of the technology stack, and China strikes right back at the base.
That's the core insight from the material we look at, absolutely. On the U.S. side, the strategy is laser-focused on intense technological containment. We're talking export controls on the most advanced semiconductors, the really complex machinery needed to make them, and especially those chips powering high-end AI. Washington's goal here seems pretty clear. Slow down China's climb up that technological value chain. Sort of starve the high-tech future, if you will.
Starve the future, wow.
Yeah. And China's counter-leverage, conversely, it's these targeted export controls on critical raw materials. This means things like rare earth metals, obviously, but also graphite, other specialized materials needed for, well, everything from defense platforms to advanced drone technology. The analysis we reviewed summed it up quite nicely. The U.S. went high-end blocking chips. China went low-end blocking minerals.
Oh.
And the key point is both are absolutely essential for any modern economy to function.
Okay, but does that symmetry really hold up perfectly? I mean, think about the immediate impact. Chips affect cutting-edge software, future military stuff, but the rare earth move, that low-end strike, it feels like it attacks the actual physical foundation of almost everything we build today.
That's a fair point. The timelines are different.
When you look at the names neodymium, dysprosium, I mean, these aren't just obscure elements on the periodic table anymore, are they? They're the essential building blocks for every high-tech magnet, the kind you need for electric motors, for precision guidance systems, advanced radar.
Critical components.
Exactly. And that brings us right to the key question for you, the listener, to think about. Why are China's rare earth controls so powerful, especially when we hear the minerals themselves aren't actually that scarce?
Right, and that's the crucial distinction. The power, as we discussed before, it's really in the processing, not the initial mining. Rare earth elements themselves, geologically, they're actually quite common in the Earth's crust.
Yeah.
The problem, the real bottleneck, is separating and refining them into usable metals and magnets. It's notoriously difficult, it's toxic, and it's an environmentally demanding process. Very dirty work.
Difficult and toxic.
Yeah. And starting back in the 1990s, really, when Western nations were, let's be honest, offloading a lot of these environmentally challenging industries, China saw an opportunity. With heavy state subsidies, they built this globally dominant, centralized industrial capacity for refining. So today, even though China only holds about a third of the world's actual geological reserves, they refine more than 85% of the world's rare earths. That's a staggering figure. The world effectively, maybe unintentionally, outsourced its heavy industrial foundation for these critical materials almost entirely to one country.
Hold on, 85%. If the refining process is that toxic, and so obviously a strategic vulnerability, why hasn't the U.S., forced American companies or heavily incentivized them to restart or build up equivalent domestic processing capacity now, or years ago?
Well, that's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? It comes down to economics and regulations mostly. It involves massive upfront capital investment to build these plants.
Yeah.
Then you have really stringent environmental regulations in the West, which adds cost and complexity. And critically, there's a multi-year lag before any new facility could actually produce these materials at the scale needed.
Yeah.
It's not a quick fix. For decades, it was just fundamentally cheaper and easier to buy the refined materials from China. That efficiency mindset, optimizing for cost.
Yeah.
It created this massive single point of failure that we're now confronting.
And that single point of failure, that leads us straight to the vulnerability that must keep Pentagon planners awake at night.
Right.
We're talking about the strategic consequences for the U.S. military-industrial complex, the systems that really define American global power projection.
Indeed. The
Yeah.
source material we reviewed details some pretty staggering dependencies. Take the F-35 fighter jet, the absolute workhorse of American air superiority. It requires a massive 417 kilograms of rare earth elements
417 kilos in one jet.
in one jet, mostly for its advanced flight control systems, its sensors, its radar. And then you have things like the Virginia-class nuclear submarines. They rely heavily on specialized rare earth magnets for their propulsion systems, for advanced sonar, for overall silent operations. It's embedded deep within critical systems.
So this exposure, it gives Beijing this immense kind of quiet leverage, doesn't
It
it?
really does. A sudden choke on supply, or even just significant price hikes, and the uncertainty about manufacturing stability, that could severely slow down U.S. production of crucial munitions, precision components. Think about it. If Washington needs to rapidly ramp up production to sustain a proxy conflict, like, say, supporting the war effort in Ukraine, China potentially holds a strategic veto over those critical supply chains. And they can exercise it without ever deploying a single soldier. It's powerful economic statecraft.
Wow. And the risk isn't just confined to the military sphere, right? That same dependency hits the global push toward clean energy.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge issue there, too. The powerful permanent magnets needed for those massive offshore wind turbines and for the high-performance electric car motors everyone's talking about. They require specific rare earths, especially neodymium and dysprosium. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, they've estimated that if China were to impose a severe, sustained shortage, well, it could potentially delay global EV production by up to 10 million units.
10 million EVs delayed.
That's the potential scale. We essentially built the entire global renewable energy future on this incredibly fragile, single-source industrial arrangement. It's quite something when you step back and look at it.
It really puts the potential cost of this disruption into very, very stark relief. Okay, so if that's the hammer China wields, let's pivot back to the U.S. counterweapon. These massive tariff threats being floated in Washington. We're hearing talks of potentially 100%, even 130% tariffs on large segments of Chinese goods. What's the immediate impact of escalating that side of the conflict right here on the American economy?
Well, the domestic economic blowback is pretty painful and immediate. There's no getting around that. Tariffs, fundamentally, are a tax, and they're paid by the importer, which usually means U.S. businesses and then ultimately U.S. consumers. Analysts estimate that a broad 130% tariff could raise costs for the average U.S. household by a really substantial amount, something like $1,200 to $1,500 per year.
Ouch. $1,200 to $1,500.
Yeah, that's essentially a hidden tax hitting American consumers directly, and it feeds domestic inflation, which is obviously still a sensitive issue.
That is a staggering number. I mean, $1,500 a year, that's a really tough pill for many families to swallow, especially for what might seem like a symbolic political win. So how do politicians justify that kind of immediate pain to the voting public?
It's largely justified through symbolism and political messaging. Tariffs, well, they play exceptionally well across both political parties, actually. They're the most visible, most easily understood signal of toughness on China. It's classic populism versus maybe economic pragmatism. The short-term economic strain, that $1,500 cost, is often dismissed or downplayed in favor of the perceived long-term goal, which is framed as punishing unfair trade practices and forcing supply chains to relocate eventually.
Right, the long game argument.
Exactly.
And this political theater, this toughness signaling, it's now apparently running headlong into a major legal constraint, one that could potentially redefine U.S. executive power in this whole arena.
This is a crucial, but I think often overlooked element of the whole conflict. The trade war is now getting deeply entangled in a constitutional debate here in the U.S. Lower courts have actually ruled that the executive branch's sweeping tariff powers, specifically the ones they've been using under a statute called IEEP, might actually exceed their authority without explicit, formal congressional approval for these specific actions.
Okay, hang on. For the listener who doesn't follow constitutional law closely, what exactly is IEPA and what does this judicial pushback mean in, plain English?
Right. So IEPA stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's a law from the 70s. It essentially allows the president to take pretty extraordinary economic measures, like sanctions or tariffs, but typically during a declared national emergency.
Okay, an emergency.
Yes. So in plain English, some courts are now saying the president can't just use an existing decades-old trade dispute, even a serious one, as the automatic grounds for unilaterally slapping on massive new tariffs, like this proposed 130% rate, without going back to Congress. They're arguing this essentially amounts to the president making economic law by decree, bypassing the legislative branch's power of the purse and trade regulation authority.
So a check on executive power, essentially.
Exactly. And if this kind of ruling is eventually upheld, say by the Supreme Court, it would fundamentally limit the president's ability to wage these kinds of unilateral economic wars. It would force America's trade strategy back towards needing more consensus, back towards those constitutional checks and balances. Policy might then be forced to become less about sudden, populist tariffs driven by immediate politics and more about genuine cross-party, long-term strategic thinking, which arguably is needed.
That's a huge potential shift. Okay, so if the two biggest economic giants are locked in this high-stakes game of a mutually assured disruption, what does all this mean for the rest of the world? We must be seeing a global domino effect as allies and other countries scramble to deal with this.
Oh, absolutely. The vulnerability of U.S. allies is extremely high in many cases. Take Japan, for instance. They import nearly all of their rare earths directly from China. And they are still, understandably, deeply scarred by the supply halt China imposed on them back in 2010 over a territorial dispute. Analysts suggest that for Japan to achieve full supply chain insulation, it could take a very costly 5 to 7 years, maybe longer.
5 to 7 years.
Yeah. Similarly, you look at the European Union. Their massive car and aerospace industries are incredibly exposed. The EU is now racing to pass its own version of a Rare Earths Act to try and secure some domestic capacity.
And what about places like Australia or Canada? They have the raw resources, right?
They do have the resources. They're resource rich, but they face that same huge bottleneck, the processing. They can mine the ore, yes, but non-Chinese processing capacity globally remains incredibly low. Currently, less than 15% of global demand can be met outside of China. Building new refineries, as we discussed, takes years and huge investment. So the inability to refine the material, that's the critical constraint. And China's massive head start there is almost insurmountable in the short to medium term.
Right, processing is key. Meanwhile, China isn't just sitting back playing defense with minerals, are they? They seem to be using this conflict to actually solidify their long-term position. Tell us a bit about this idea of a rare earth belt and road initiative.
That's a very astute way China is playing this. It's about diversifying their own risk while simultaneously tightening their control over the global mineral market long term. It involves, first, strengthening nationalist sentiment domestically, framing this as resisting Western pressure. But externally, it means accelerating strategic deals with countries, particularly in the global south. We're talking about Chinese state-backed companies funding exploration, investing in mines, and crucially, building processing plants in emerging economies.
Exporting the processing.
Exactly. Exporting the processing, often in exchange for exclusive long-term supply agreements for the refined materials. It's a way to secure their mineral future by, essentially, exporting some of the dirty work to allies and partners, making China itself less vulnerable to future Western boycotts or environmental pressures while still controlling the flow.
Clever, in a way. It just brings us right back to that core strategic concept we started with. This really isn't decoupling, is it? It's mutually assured disruption. The U.S. can target China's advanced technology aspirations. China can target the foundational industrial base of the U.S. and its allies. The stated U.S. goal, as national security officials keep saying, is de-risking, not full decoupling.
And it's important we define that jargon clearly for everyone listening. De-risking really means building redundant supply lines, trying to increase the number of reliable sources for critical goods, focusing on resilience rather than pure cost efficiency. It does not mean cutting off trade entirely. Full decoupling, actually severing all major economic ties between the U.S. and China. That's probably economically impossible without triggering a massive global depression. Nobody truly wants that. So instead, we're now in this phase of permanent strategic interdependence. We still rely on each other for many things, but we've effectively armed our dependency. It's a very tense stability.
It feels like the age of globalization, which promised maximum efficiency above all else.
Right.
Well, that's giving way to a new age of fragmentation. This new age promises resilience, maybe, but that resilience clearly comes at a measurable high cost, driven by building redundancy, duplication, maybe nearshoring.
The higher cost, yes.
This standoff really seems like it could be the defining feature of the 21st century global economy.
And maybe here's the core takeaway, or at least a potential silver lining that some of the source material points towards. It offers maybe a moment for cautious optimism. The line was, economic pain, while serious, is reversible, war is not. If this conflict, this intense rivalry, can remain contained as a kind of cold peace fought primarily through tariffs, export controls, investment screening, rather than escalating to military conflict, then the world has a better chance of managing this intense strategic fear.
A cold peace, managed through economic tools. That sounds preferable to the alternative, certainly. The challenge, then, for both nations is somehow transforming that primal fear of the other's rise, that classic Thucydides Trap dynamic, into the kind of wisdom that dictates restraint, that finds off-ramps. But the question we really want to leave you, the listener, to explore is this. Can a country truly achieve long-term national security when the essential materials for its most advanced weapons, its most critical infrastructure, rely fundamentally on the industrial control of its chief geopolitical rival?
That's the uncomfortable question at the heart of it all. Where might the next critical vulnerability be found? And how do we navigate that without triggering something worse? A lot to think about.